On this Thursday night, record heat and a push to reduce the risk of wildfires, reviving Indigenous methods of managing forests.
You would see a big change for the better.
And a new warning about the summer's wildfire forecast. The Wagner boss back in Russia, sparking skepticism about his safety. A somber anniversary.
I have dreams about what happened.
Lac Megantic remembers 10 years after disaster struck. Plus, Mother Nature and motherhood. Does the summer affect fertility?
Global National with Donna Friesen. Reporting tonight, Jeff Semple.
Good evening and thank you for joining us. The last 3 days were the world's hottest ever recorded. Millions of Canadians are contending with scorching temperatures, with weather warnings now stretching from coast to coast to coast. Heat continues to blanket southern Ontario and Quebec, and Health Canada is adding new warnings for parts of Atlantic Canada, British Columbia, Yukon, and the Northwest Territories. Special weather statements for poor air quality are also in place in several regions, while Quebec is dealing with severe thunderstorm watches. That prolonged heat has officials urging people to stay indoors if they can, and doctors are now seeing the impact of these extreme temperatures. Touria Izri has our top story tonight.
Throwing a party gets more complicated under the scorching sun.
We do things like put out water stations.
Temperatures are soaring at the height of festival season. 30,000 people are expected to pack the opening of Ottawa's annual Blues Fest. And beer won't be the only thing flowing.
Up near the front of the stage, we have hoses that we hose down the audience that's right up front. We have water bottles that get handed out up there. We do everything we can to help the public stay safe.
But staying outside even for a few minutes can be physically exhausting.
I could breathe a little bit. I could breathe enough.
And it's hot, you get sweaty, but I mean, you got to get around somehow.
I've got another 10 minutes to an hour max, and then I'm done for the day.
The oppressive heat and unprecedented wildfire season are creating a dangerous combination.
In Ottawa, we have not seen this degree of air pollution.
Respirologists are dealing with a surge in patients this summer.
We're seeing more people calling who are sick in the last 2 or 3 weeks and are needing treatment for their underlying lung disease, which has gotten worse.
Ottawa is urging people to stay inside and stay hydrated to avoid straining hospitals.
Over the last few weeks in particular, we have seen emergency departments significantly impacted.
The Canadian Climate Institute studies the health effects of a warming planet. A recent report estimates by the middle of the century, the sweltering heat will cause an additional 400 deaths a year in Canada and cost the healthcare system an extra $4 billion annually.
The evidence is clear that this is a real threat for Canada. It could affect the country somewhere, anytime, any summer.
Relief is on the way with the extreme heat expected to taper off. But higher than normal temperatures are in the forecast all summer, meaning more risk for the vulnerable and more pressure on the healthcare system. Jeff?
Touria Izri in Ottawa. Thanks, Touria. And that heat is fueling a wildfire season unlike anything Canada has seen before. Today, government officials and experts offered their wildfire forecast for the coming months and warned the worst is far from over.
Drought conditions, when coupled with above normal temperatures across most of the country, means that the risk of fire activity is going to remain very high throughout the majority of the summer. In July, most of Canada, from British Columbia and the north through to the prairies and across the country to Western Labrador, will be at high risk.
Here are the latest numbers. More than 640 fires are burning right now across the country. Of those, more than half are out of control. But it's the total from the past couple of months that's most staggering. So far this year, Canada has seen more than 3,400 wildfires, and some 88,000 square kilometers have burned. That's more than 10 times the average from the past decade. As a result, 155,000 Canadians have been forced from their homes, the most in nearly half a century. Canada has called for backup, with more than 3,200 firefighting personnel arriving from around the world. But more assistance is needed, and there are calls for the government to remove obstacles so Indigenous communities can help. Yourex-West reports.
When a wildfire burned out of control in late May, More than 800 people of Fort Chipewyan, north of Fort McMurray, were forced from their homes.
I did get emotional, thinking, God, please make sure our community's safe.
With no summer road access, the community had to be evacuated by air over 3 anxious days.
Even though Indigenous people only make up 5% of the Canadian population, they make up 42% of wildfire evacuees. So it's a really disproportionate impact on those communities.
With that impact only expected to intensify, wildfire researcher Amy Cardinal-Christensen believes it's time traditional Indigenous ways of managing Canada's forests are restored.
But when you're actually living on that land, you can really see okay, now's the time to burn. What they did with fire was basically to bring things closer to them. So they would produce a mosaic on the landscape. So for example, they would burn near their settlement so that, grass would come up earlier so that then they could have deer and moose that would come to the area to eat.
British Columbia was the first province to outlaw cultural burning in 1874. The rest of Canada followed in the early 1900s. But on her own private property, Cardinal-Christensen has brought the practice back, maintaining this fire break on her land near Rocky Mountain House.
If we weren't doing this, this would just grow over and we'd pretty much have a continuous forest here.
Done at the end of winter or in the very late fall and accompanied with a ceremony, Cardinal-Christensen says the burning promotes a healthy forest while reducing the risk of wildfires growing out of control. It's a practice Indigenous leaders say many communities are longing to do.
If we were to have more access in the ceremonies, you would see a big change for the better.
I can't walk around like I used to when I was a kid because the forest is too dense.
Parks Canada has started to work with Indigenous partners to bring cultural burns and other traditional practices back. But in order to make a difference,
swing around in here.
Cardinal-Christensen says they will have to occur regularly on a scale that allows large areas of forests and the communities within them to benefit. Heather Yourex-West, Global News, near Rocky Mountain House, Alberta.
With many relying on air conditioning this week, Montreal is reporting a widespread power outage tonight, affecting nearly 200,000 customers. A little later in the newscast, we'll take a closer look at how Canadians without AC are struggling to stay cool. Well, as we first reported yesterday, Ottawa has struck a deal with Stellantis and LG Energy Solutions to resume construction of their electric vehicle battery plant in Windsor, Ontario. And we're now learning how much the federal and provincial governments are willing to pay to keep the wheels in motion. The two companies are set to receive up to $15 billion in performance incentives. Mackenzie Gray looks at whether that money is well spent.
It's one of the largest corporate subsidies in Canadian history. European car maker Stellantis getting a $15 billion deal from the federal and Ontario governments.
Our government was absolutely determined that Canada get its fair share of those green jobs.
The agreement sees construction of an electric vehicle battery plant resuming in Windsor after the car maker and their South Korean partner LG Energy walked away from the plant in May. Stellantis, which owns brands such as Dodge, Jeep and Fiat, wanted Canada to cough up more cash, saying the original deal of $1 billion from the feds and province wasn't enough to keep up with massive new American subsidies in Joe Biden's Inflation Reduction Act.
If they were 1,000 yards over the border, they'd be collecting billions of dollars in tax breaks. And so this is an historic response.
Those billions will create an estimated 2,500 new jobs. That works out to $6 million per employee. But the union representing those workers says it's about the sector overall.
This also secures thousands and thousands of jobs that we already have in Windsor and Brampton.
Ontario's one-third share is based on tax credits, which will more than cover the $5 billion cost to build the plant. It will also dwarf money spent on other major Liberal promises. 5 years of dental care set at $13 billion. Yesterday's increase to the GST tax credit, a mere $2.5 billion. And if both governments wanted to stay in the car game, they could have bought 22% of Stellantis for the same amount of money.
Well, I'm not sure that Stellantis would describe it as blackmail, but I think a lot of people might, in more casual conversation, provide similar verbiage.
Both governments signed a similar deal previously, giving $13 billion in subsidies to Volkswagen to build a similar electric battery plant in St. Thomas, Ontario. And more companies are looking for comparable deals.
We can't do everyone. We could probably do another 2 or 3.
And if those deals do materialize, the innovation minister says Canada's willing to give similar subsidies to attract more business. Jeff?
Mackenzie Gray in Ottawa. Thanks, Mac. The Wagner mercenary leader who led a brief mutiny against the Kremlin is reportedly back on Russian soil. If true, it marks an unexpected twist in a power struggle that's threatened President Putin's authority. Today, in a show of force, Russia launched a missile attack on an apartment building in the western city of Lviv, far from the front lines and home to thousands displaced by the war. 5 people were killed, and as Redmond Shannon reports, the mayor is calling it the largest attack on civilian infrastructure in Lviv since the start of the invasion.
Pain and grief in a Ukrainian city that has mostly escaped the worst of this war. The Russians say they only hit military objects, says this woman. People were asleep here. How could they do this? Lviv is just 90 minutes from the border with NATO member Poland. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky promised revenge against Russia as he visited another NATO country, Bulgaria, ratcheting up pressure for NATO membership after the war. On the other side of the conflict, Vladimir Putin's biggest ally boasted about his newly acquired Russian nuclear bombs. Belarusia's Alexander Lukashenko also threw a new verbal grenade into the Prigozhin mutiny saga. He said the Wagner mercenary boss is no longer in Belarus, but St. Petersburg, Russia, insisting Putin won't kill him. Less than 2 weeks ago, Lukashenko claimed to have brokered a deal with Putin and Prigozhin to end the short-lived rebellion. At that time, he claimed to have welcomed the notorious mercenary boss to Belarus, a deal which supposedly gave Prigozhin safety.
Let's be honest, Alexander Lukashenko is a man very comfortable with lying to the world.
On Russian state TV this week, footage of an apparent raid on Prigozhin's St. Petersburg mansion included a photo of a cabinet of wigs. 2 Western media reports say Prigozhin went back to get some of these weapons. Despite Russian media claims, criminal investigations against him remain open.
Yevgeny Prigozhin is a survivor, and I don't think he would be making this decision if he thought that he couldn't survive it. And let's be honest, he has significant resources at his disposal.
The fate of those resources, Prigozhin's army of mercenaries, may be up for grabs too. Lukashenko cryptically said moving troops to Belarus still depends on the decisions of the Kremlin and Wagner Group. Redmond Shannon, Global News, London.
The U.S. has released video of what it says are Russian fighter jets flying dangerously close to American drones in Syria. The footage shows the jets setting off parachute flares near the drones, appearing to block their view. The U.S. says the drones were monitoring targets of the so-called Islamic State and were not armed. The Americans called Russia's behavior reckless, representing a new level of unsafe action. Russia has been a strong supporter of the Syrian regime in its long, bloody civil war. Fatal fire. Coming up, firefighters are killed after a cargo ship erupts in flames. In New Jersey, 2 firefighters have been killed battling flames on board an Italian cargo ship carrying more than 1,000 vehicles and containers. That fire erupted at around 9:30 Wednesday night while the ship was docked at the port of Newark, one of the busiest on the U.S. East Coast. An investigation into the fire is now underway. Well, across Canada, many people are upgrading to an air conditioning unit as these hotter days become the norm. But that's not an option for everyone. Anne Gaviola explains why renters are among the most vulnerable in this extreme weather.
It's unbearable.
Rob Katzel and other renters in his building say they haven't had AC during this heat wave. They've been told the landlord is working on it.
I have a 1-week-old son, so he's not coping with this weather very well, and our heat is just brutal.
Situations like this are the reason the city of Hamilton is next year set to become the first place in Canada requiring landlords to provide air conditioning on the hottest days. The bylaw sets a maximum heat standard for indoor spaces, 26 degrees Celsius.
Renters do not have the ability to affect the structure of the homes that they live in to the same degree that homeowners or condo owners do.
Some are more vulnerable to the mercury climbing.
Those most at risk of heat-related deaths and illness are seniors, people with disabilities, low-income households, and racialized and tenant communities.
Exposure to excessive heat is dangerous.
When your cognitive function starts to be affected, that's when you know, in addition to the high temperature, that it's a medical emergency and you should head to the hospital, call 911 right away.
Climate experts say this trend is poised to get much worse, especially in cities with lots of people, roads, and congestion.
The urban heat island effect is basically the phenomenon that means that cities are hotter than the surrounding rural areas,
raising the risk for tenants in densely populated parts of the country.
Not only can surfaces be 10 to 15 degrees hotter in cities, they actually retain the heat.
A warning call to protect the most vulnerable as heat waves become more frequent and more intense. Anne Gaviola, Global News, Toronto.
Family planning still ahead. A new study suggests the summer can impact in vitro fertilization. Welcome back. Prospective parents who are going through the in vitro fertilization process may have a new way to increase their odds of success. A study out of Australia suggests the time of year when eggs are retrieved could influence the outcome. Catherine Ward explains.
Tiny cries and little hands. Small wonders that can make an IVF journey well worth struggle and loss, as Vanessa Robinson knows all too well.
Having James and seeing him and holding him, it's really indescribable. It's the greatest reward possible at the end of a difficult journey.
For some people, becoming a parent takes time.
Lots of embryos these days are transferred or placed back in the womb, having been frozen for months and sometimes years.
New data out of Australia indicates that for frozen embryo transfers, the season in which eggs are retrieved is one factor that influences the outcome.
We found that if the egg had been collected in summer as opposed to in autumn, which is where we saw the lowest live birth rates, the odds of having a live birth from that embryo transfer were 30% higher, regardless of when the embryo actually went back.
While doctors haven't been able to fully explain the link, researchers believe melatonin could be part of the equation. But Canadian fertility specialist Dr. Evan Turk says there are other factors to consider.
Is it the sunshine that's doing it? Is it other behavioral factors such as diet, lifestyle, the air quality? We know that changes from season to season.
And then there's the other half of the reproductive equation, the sperm.
There's not really a lot of sperm information. So could these same seasonal effects that may be impacting the eggs also be affecting the male factor side where applicable?
But even as researchers learn more, they say family planning should continue on a track that's right for the parents, regardless of the season. Catherine Ward, Global News, Toronto.
Up next, 10 years since one of Canada's deadliest rail disasters, Lac Megantic, marks a painful anniversary. Ten years on from one of Canada's worst ever rail disasters, residents in the tightly knit community of Lac Megantic, Quebec, say they will never forget. Today, the town of around 6,000 gathered for a commemorative mass, honoring the 47 lives lost when a runaway train carrying crude oil derailed in the middle of town. For those who live in Lac Megantic, life has never been the same. And as Dan Spector explains, today was about reflection and also making sure a similar tragedy never happens again.
The bells at the St. Agnes Church toll 47 times, one for each of those who died on that horror-filled night. A decade after the disaster that marked this small town forever, emotions are still raw.
Oublier, ça, c'est impossible. Mais accepter, c'est possible.
Yolande Boulet-Boulanger lost her 19-year-old grandson that night. She was among the hundreds attending a commemorative mass at the church just steps from where a runaway train hauling millions of tons of crude oil derailed and exploded on July 6, 2013, leaving much of the downtown area completely devastated. The inferno engulfed her grandson's apartment.
C'est déjà pas normal de voir partir nos enfants.
It's not normal for a grandmother to live through the death of a grandchild, she says.
Every night, sometimes I have dreams about Lac Megantic and what happened.
Denis Lauzon was the fire chief back then. He says he's doing better now, but dark memories still haunt him, like when a little girl asked if he'd seen her parents, but he knew they were gone.
I said, no, I didn't see them. I wish I could see them.
People from surrounding towns and beyond gathered in Lac Megantic to mark the grim anniversary. Hundreds attended the commemorative mass, including the Prime Minister and members of his cabinet. Justin Trudeau took the opportunity to underline how work should finally start this fall to move the tracks out of the now rebuilt downtown.
It's been a longer process than anyone would have liked.
Years of negotiations have resulted in expropriations. Yolande Boulet-Boulanger is opposed to the current plan. The trains would go right through her land.
Elle est néfaste.
It's harmful, she says, pointing to the environmental destruction that will result. Others just want to see the tracks leave town.
Because a tragedy may happen anytime.
While not everyone agrees on the future of the tracks, many found value in remembering together.
Life and love is in the art of everything.
Dan Spector, Global News, Lac Megantic, Quebec.
And that is Global National for this Thursday night. I'm Jeff Semple, and our thoughts tonight are with the people of Lac Megantic, remembering the 47 lives lost from that rail disaster 10 years ago. Thanks for watching. Have a good night.